Have you ever noticed that nothing in your life is falling apart? Yet it no longer pulls you forward when urgency fades, clarity goes quiet, and stillness starts to feel heavier than movement. It's not confusion, it's a deeper internal reorganization, preparing a shift. This is where Daniel's story begins, not with a crisis, but with the quiet moment when the life he had built stopped needing to be protected. Daniel had built his life around observation. As a journalist, that was the job to stand close enough to truth to see it clearly, but far enough away to remain untouched. He had covered protests and courtrooms, disasters and quiet human losses that never made headlines. He had listened to grief without absorbing it, documented injustice without becoming consumed by it. That distance was not coldness, it was discipline. Daniel believed emotions belonged behind the story, not inside it. His responsibility was clarity, accuracy, to bring truth forward without distortion. For years, that principle worked. He told himself his mind was sharp because his heart stayed guarded, that witnessing did not require participation, that objectivity meant remaining intact. And for a long time, he was right. Until one assignment changed the way his inner world responded. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve danger or tragedy. It was a long-form interview, a man speaking calmly about a life quietly dismantled by circumstances no one had bothered to notice. There were no tears, no accusations. Just facts delivered with unsettling steadiness. Daniel listened, took notes, asked the right questions. But something slipped past his usual defenses. Not empathy, not sadness, recognition. For the first time in years, Daniel noticed a reaction he didn't immediately file away. A pause. A subtle tightening in the chest. A quiet awareness that what he was witnessing wasn't just information. It was resonance. He finished the piece professionally. The article ran. Readers responded. And externally, everything continued as usual. But internally, something had shifted. Daniel didn't feel shaken. He didn't feel emotional. He felt less certain. Not about the story, but about himself. He began noticing things he would normally dismiss, the way certain narratives no longer energized him, how urgency drained faster than it used to, how the act of reporting started to feel mechanical instead of meaningful. The stories were still true, they just no longer organized him. That confused him. Daniel had always believed that bearing witness was enough, that staying neutral kept him strong, that meaning came from exposure to truth, not from how truth landed inside him. But now, after years of witnessing everything, he felt something loosening. Not his standards, not his ethics, his attachment. The identity of the observer no longer felt as solid as it once did. He still cared deeply about truth. He just no longer felt compelled to armor himself against it. And that scared him more than any dangerous assignment ever had. Because journalists are trained to analyze the world, not themselves. Daniel could trace causes, verify sources, cross-check facts. But this experience resisted interpretation. It wasn't burnout. He wasn't cynical. He wasn't disillusioned. He simply felt less invested in maintaining the distance he had once believed was essential. There was no breakdown, no dramatic loss of faith, just a subtle erosion of the inner posture that had defined him for decades. He noticed the shift in his body before he noticed it in his thoughts. Interviews no longer triggered the same internal bracing. Editorial pressure landed softer. Silence between questions felt longer and strangely more honest. The world hadn't changed. Daniel had. Or more precisely, The version of himself that needed to stay untouched by the world was quietly stepping aside. This was not a crisis of purpose. It was a loosening of identity. And it didn't demand action. It didn't ask for explanation. It simply created space. For the first time, Daniel wasn't just observing reality. He was aware that something inside him was reorganizing in response to it. And that awareness, that quiet internal shift, was the first signal. Not of failure, not of weakness, but of a deeper transition already underway. He didn't know it yet, but the observer was about to become part of the story. And once that line is crossed, even subtly, there is no returning to the old distance. This is where the real process begins. After that assignment, Daniel expected things to settle back into place. They didn't. Instead of returning to his familiar internal distance, he found himself caught between two instincts that had never conflicted before. The first was professional. Remain objective. Do not personalize. Do not let emotion interfere with clarity. The second was quieter and harder to categorize. A sense that the distance he relied on no longer felt honest. This unsettled him more than any emotional reaction would have. Journalists are trained to regulate themselves, to compartmentalize, to witness without absorbing. Daniel had done this for decades. He believed his ability to stay composed was proof of resilience. But now, he noticed something subtle. It wasn't that stories affected him more. It was that they affected him differently. The familiar internal bracing, the tension he used to carry into interviews, was gone. In its place was a strange neutrality, not numbness, not overwhelm, just less resistance. He found himself listening without tightening, asking questions without rehearsing emotional distance, letting silence exist without rushing to control it. This created an unexpected conflict. If he wasn't bracing, what was holding him together? Daniel began questioning something he had never examined before. Was his objectivity clarity, or was it regulation? From a nervous system perspective, what Daniel was experiencing wasn't psychological confusion. It was physiological reorganization. For years, his body had learned to function in a high-alert, high-information environment. Deadlines, pressure, responsibility, exposure to intense human stories. Even when he felt calm, his nervous system was subtly activated, prepared, vigilant, controlled. This is a common pattern in professions built on observation under pressure. The body adapts. The stress becomes familiar. The activation becomes baseline. But when emotional charge begins to detach from habitual thought loops, that baseline changes. The nervous system exits chronic alertness and moves toward regulation. And when that happens, the mind loses its usual reference points. This is why Daniel didn't feel inspired or clear. Clarity belongs to stability, not transition. What he felt instead was suspension. His system was no longer organized around constant readiness. The vigilance softened. The need to manage perception relaxed, biologically. This is what happens when the autonomic nervous system shifts out of survival-based control and into coherence. Heart rhythms stabilize. Stress hormones decrease. The body stops scanning for threat, even subtle, professional threat. But here's the part most people don't expect. When regulation arrives, intensity disappears first. And for someone like Daniel, intensity had always been mistaken for engagement. Without it, the work felt quieter. The urgency faded. The internal noise dropped. And silence, when you're not used to it, can feel like loss. This is where the conflict deepened. Daniel wasn't losing his commitment to truth. He wasn't becoming careless or detached from reality. He was losing the internal tension that had once organized his sense of purpose. And without that tension, he didn't know how to locate himself. He noticed it in editorial meetings. The pressure to frame stories a certain way no longer triggered the same internal pushback. Not because he agreed more, but because he didn't feel compelled to fight. He noticed it in himself. Less urgency to be right. Less attachment to being the one who saw things clearly first. This frightened him. Because if objectivity wasn't anchored in control, what was it anchored in? The mind doesn't like unanswered questions, especially when identity is involved. So Daniel tried to analyze the experience. He searched for explanations, wondered if this was burnout in disguise, questioned whether he was losing his edge. But none of those explanations fit. Burnout involves depletion. Daniel felt more spacious, not exhausted. Disengagement involves avoidance. Daniel was more present than ever. What he was experiencing was not withdrawal. It was recalibration. His nervous system was no longer organizing itself around pressure, and the identity built on that pressure had nowhere to anchor. This is why the conflict felt internal rather than external. Nothing in his life demanded change, but something inside him no longer responded the way it used to. From the outside, Daniel looked steady. From the inside, the framework that once held his certainty together was loosening. And this is the part most people misinterpret. They assume discomfort means something is wrong, that uncertainty must be resolved, that identity should feel solid at all times. But neurologically, this phase is not collapse. It's transition, a liminal state where the old regulatory pattern no longer dominates, and the new one hasn't fully stabilized yet. The body has moved first, the mind hasn't caught up, and when the body leads, the mind temporarily loses authority. That's why Daniel felt unsettled without being distressed, why he felt calm without feeling clear. This wasn't a crisis of truth. It was the quiet dismantling of the internal posture that once made truth feel manageable. And once that posture begins to soften, returning to the old way of being no longer feels natural. The observer was still present, but the distance was gone, and without that distance, a different relationship to reality was beginning to form. Daniel didn't know where this was leading yet, but he could sense one thing clearly. Staying exactly the same was no longer neutral. It required effort. And effort, for the first time in his life, felt heavier than change. That's when the next shift began to approach. Not as a decision, not as a plan, but as a readiness that hadn't existed before. Nothing resolved overnight. The conflict didn't disappear. It simply stopped demanding attention. Daniel didn't wake up one day deciding to change his life. There was no conclusion, no plan forming in the background, no vision of a different future pulling at him yet. What changed first was subtler than that. His relationship to stillness began to shift. He noticed it in moments that used to feel neutral. Sitting at his desk after filing a story, standing still in an elevator between floors, driving home without the usual mental replay of the day. These pauses felt different now, not empty, not restless, heavy, as if remaining exactly where he was required more energy than it used to. This was new. Daniel had always been good at holding position, at waiting, at staying composed until clarity arrived. But now, clarity wasn't coming, and, strangely, it no longer felt necessary. Instead, something else was happening beneath his thoughts. His reactions softened. Stories that once triggered immediate analysis now passed through him with less internal commentary. Editorial pressure no longer tightened his chest. Questions arose, but they didn't demand answers right away. This wasn't indifference to reality. It was a shift in how reality landed in his body. From a nervous system perspective, this is what happens when regulation stabilizes enough that the system no longer relies on anticipation to feel safe. The constant internal rehearsal, the scanning, predicting, bracing, begins to shut down. When that happens, perception changes. You don't see more. You see differently. Daniel noticed that he was responding instead of preparing, listening without formulating follow-ups in advance, pausing before speaking, not to choose words carefully, but because nothing needed to be defended. This created a strange sensation. He felt less busy internally, yet more alert, less driven, yet more precise. And because there was no emotional spike attached to it, he almost dismissed it. But the body doesn't lie in subtle transitions. He noticed tension releasing from places he hadn't realized were holding. Shoulders dropping during conversations, breath slowing without intention, jaw unclenching while listening. Nothing dramatic, just the absence of effort. These changes didn't announce meaning. They didn't come with insight. They came with neutrality. And neutrality, when you've lived on intensity, can feel suspicious. Daniel wondered if he was disengaging. But disengagement pulls away from experience. This felt like moving closer without gripping. He was still present, still observant, still precise. But the inner posture had shifted. This is one of the most misunderstood phases before a quantum shift. People expect desire to rise, motivation to return, a compelling reason to act. Instead, what appears first is alignment without urgency. The nervous system stops arguing with the present moment. And when that happens, something unexpected occurs. Staying still begins to feel misaligned. Not wrong, not unbearable, just heavier than necessary. Daniel felt this during a routine assignment. Nothing about the story bothered him. Nothing pushed him toward change. But afterward, he felt a quiet resistance to continuing exactly as before. Not resistance fueled by frustration, resistance fueled by mismatch. His body was no longer organized around maintaining continuity. From a biological standpoint, this is significant. When the nervous system receives consistent signals of safety and coherence, it stops prioritizing familiarity. It becomes available for novelty. But novelty doesn't arrive as excitement. It arrives as readiness. Daniel hadn't decided to move yet. But hesitation was no longer neutral. Pausing too long began to feel like effort. Overthinking drained energy instead of preserving it. This is how movement becomes inevitable, not impulsive. Inevitable. Not because you're chasing something new, but because staying aligned with the past requires force. Daniel noticed small impulses arising. A conversation he felt drawn to initiate. A question he didn't suppress. A boundary he considered setting without rehearsing justification. These weren't plans. They were signals. Subtle invitations toward motion without guarantees. And what made them unsettling was the absence of fear. Fear had always been the signal to stop or proceed carefully. This time, fear wasn't present. Neither was confidence. There was simply a quiet sense that movement would be honest. This is where many people retreat. They mistake the lack of emotional intensity for lack of importance. They wait for certainty to return. They override the body and reassert control. But Daniel didn't do that. Not because he trusted the process, but because forcing stillness now felt dishonest. He didn't act yet. But something fundamental had changed. The internal reference point had shifted from preservation to alignment. And once that happens, action stops being a question of motivation. It becomes a matter of timing. Daniel was still standing in the same life, same job, same routines. But the internal conditions that made staying possible were dissolving. This is the moment before movement. Not dramatic, not announced. Just a quiet reorientation where the future hasn't appeared yet, but the past has lost its gravitational pull. And when that pull weakens enough, the next shift doesn't ask permission. It begins as motion, not planned, not justified, but inevitable. Daniel's first movements didn't bring relief. They brought friction, not external resistance, internal instability. He noticed it after the smallest breaks in routine. Declining an assignment without over-explaining. Speaking more honestly than strategically. Allowing silence where he once filled space with control. Nothing dramatic happened. Yet inside, something tightened. Not fear, not anxiety, disorientation. From a neuroscience perspective, this response is understandable. For most of Daniel's adult life, his nervous system had adapted to a world that required constant alertness deadlines. Responsibility, moral pressure, and the unspoken demand to stay composed under scrutiny. Over time, the body adjusts. When a certain level of tension is experienced repeatedly, the nervous system can begin to treat that state as normal, even if it originated as stress. This is how a baseline forms not by choice, but by repetition. Identity often builds around this state. I'm clear because I stay controlled. I'm effective because I stay vigilant. I'm safe because I stay ahead. But when Daniel began acting from alignment instead of prediction, that baseline was disrupted. And when a familiar baseline shifts, the nervous system temporarily loses its internal reference point. The brain relies heavily on prediction to maintain a sense of stability. It continuously models what should happen next and prepares the body accordingly. When those predictions stop matching incoming signals, tension increases not because something is wrong, but because the system lacks familiarity. This helps explain why Daniel's discomfort felt reasonable. Thoughts arose that sounded responsible. Maybe this is reckless. Maybe I'm misreading this. Maybe I should regain clarity before continuing. These thoughts didn't come from insight. They came from the system attempting to restore equilibrium. In neuroscience, this process is often described as prediction error, a mismatch between expected patterns and present experience. When prediction fails, the nervous system seeks resolution, not growth. And the fastest resolution is often a return to what is known. This is why the urge to retreat can feel intelligent during periods of transition. Daniel felt this tension clearly. Part of him wanted to stabilize, to explain, to justify, to regain control. Another part recognized that returning to the old posture now required effort, and effort had become heavy. Physiologically, something had already changed. His nervous system was no longer organized around constant vigilance. Breath slowed more naturally. Muscular tension reduced. Internal noise softened. Once the body experiences regulation, it resists returning to chronic tension. So the discomfort Daniel felt wasn't danger. It was identity friction, the nervous system no longer supporting the internal posture his old identity depended on, psychologically and biologically. This is a transitional state. The previous pattern has loosened. The new one has not fully stabilized yet. The mind struggles here. It wants certainty. It wants explanation. It wants to resolve the feeling. But the nervous system doesn't need meaning. It needs tolerance. Tolerance of uncertainty. Tolerance of sensation without interpretation. Tolerance of not restoring the old structure too quickly. Daniel didn't understand this conceptually, but his body responded intuitively. Instead of reacting, he stayed present. Instead of labeling the discomfort, he observed it. Instead of fixing it, he allowed it to pass. Each time he did this, the nervous system received new information. I can remain safe without returning to the old identity. This is how internal change stabilizes, not through belief, but through repeated embodied experience. Gradually, the discomfort lost urgency, then authority, then meaning. What remained was space. Less internal effort, less self-management, less need to define who he was becoming. Externally, nothing had resolved. Internally, the grip had loosened. Daniel didn't feel finished, but he felt lighter. And in nervous system terms, lightness means available energy, energy no longer consumed by maintaining the past. This is why the next phase doesn't arrive as force. It arrives as recognition. When resistance drops far enough, alignment doesn't need to be created. It emerges. Daniel wasn't forcing change. He was no longer resisting it. And once resistance dissolves, reality has room to reorganize. Nothing suddenly changed. There was no sense of arrival. Only a quiet easing, like something heavy no longer being held. After the friction eased, something unexpected followed. Not clarity, not certainty. Release. Daniel didn't wake up feeling resolved. He didn't suddenly understand where his life was going. What changed was simpler than that. He stopped holding so tightly. The constant internal management, the need to track outcomes, anticipate reactions, explain intentions, began to fall away on its own. Not because he decided to let go, but because there was nothing left to carry. This is how stabilization begins. Not through discipline, not through willpower, through the absence of resistance. Daniel noticed it in ordinary moments. Decisions came faster, without internal debate. He responded to emails without rehearsing tone. Conversations moved forward without him steering them. Not because he stopped caring, but because caring no longer required control. From a nervous system perspective, this marked an important shift. When the body no longer spends energy maintaining an outdated pattern, that energy becomes available for perception, for responsiveness, for choice. This is what regulation looks like when it settles. The system isn't numb, it isn't passive, it's coherent. And coherence changes how reality responds. Daniel began noticing small alignments, not dramatic opportunities, not sudden breakthroughs, just timing that felt cleaner, interactions that required less effort, paths opening without force. Nothing felt miraculous. Everything felt appropriate. This is often the most overlooked phase of a quantum shift. People expect transformation to announce itself with intensity, with excitement, with visible reward. But when alignment locks in, the experience is quieter than expected. Because the work has already been done internally, the future doesn't arrive as an idea. It arrives as a pull. Daniel didn't need to visualize a new identity. He didn't need to imagine a different life. He began responding as if continuity had already shifted, because internally, it had. This is future self-alignment in its most practical form. Not belief, not imagination, embodied assumption. When choices no longer feel like choices, but responses. when movement feels natural instead of motivated, when hesitation fades, not because fear is gone, but because it no longer has authority. Looking back later, Daniel would describe this period as the moment everything changed. But in real time, nothing dramatic happened. There was no single leap, no defining decision, just a sequence completing itself. Attachment loosened. The nervous system regulated. Movement broke repetition. Discomfort was tolerated. Space opened. Alignment stabilized. What followed wasn't magic. It was momentum. Once the future became the dominant reference point, reality reorganized quickly, not because Daniel forced it, but because nothing inside him resisted it anymore. This is where many people misunderstand quantum change. They think it requires belief, discipline, or relentless intention. In truth, most quantum shifts fail, not because people lack effort, but because they interrupt a process already underway. They mistake neutrality for stagnation. They rush clarity before coherence. They reintroduce urgency just to feel familiar again. Daniel didn't avoid this because he knew better. He avoided it because his body no longer needed the old tension to feel safe. That's the difference. Once the nervous system recognizes a new pattern as home, returning to the old one feels artificial. The shift doesn't need to be protected. It stabilizes itself. If this story feels familiar, it may be because you're not waiting for a change. You're already in one. Not searching, not stuck. Just moving through a phase that doesn't announce itself loudly. There's nothing here to force. Nothing to rush. If your life feels quieter, less gripping, less urgent than it used to, that may not be a loss of direction. It may be the sign that a different timeline has already taken hold. The shift doesn't begin when everything changes. It completes when nothing inside you resists what's already changing. And once that happens, reality doesn't hesitate. It follows.